Hello and welcome. Today, I'm going to talk about state fragility and the role of sustainable economic development in Afghanistan. This topic is co-authored by myself, Bahaudin Mujtaba, and also Dr. Belay Seyoum of Nova Southeastern University. The agenda for today is to talk about what exactly is state fragility and how do you measure state fragility. One of the common questions we often receive is Afghanistan a fragile state? We'll answer that question. And finally, what can be done to overcome state fragility? As you know, a growing number of countries with weak capacity to carry out basic governance functions is leading to an unacceptable level of human suffering throughout the world. Think about places where millions of people have been displaced over the past few decades, like Afghanistan, Sudan, for example, Ethiopia, and other places throughout the world. So this study reflects on the multidimensional nature of state fragility and highlights the non-political factors that drive it. As all of us have observed, we tend to see that weak institutions become a source of state fragility by undermining social cohesion and the broader economic progress of various nations in Asia, in Africa, and Latin America, and even places like North America and Europe as well. The inability of states to perform for the benefit of their population is what is known as state fragility. So this problem has been a matter of concern for many citizens and the wider communities all over the globe. The case of fragile states that are in crisis and lag in social and economic development has created a real sense of urgency to find various productive and constructive means of improving the people's situation. 2023, more than 100 million displaced people were on the run from conflict in crisis. Armed conflict has been pushing a growing minority of the global population into a deeper crisis. For example, the armed conflict in places such as Afghanistan, Ethiopia, and Somalia have resulted in untold suffering and hardships for millions of people. It has destroyed lives and livelihoods, devastated infrastructure, and disrupted international supply chains and trade, which impacts everyone to some extent. Conflict and instability have led to limited supplies and skyrocketing inflation in food and fuel prices, both in developing and developed economies. Better understanding state fragility in places like Afghanistan means examining the role of home economics, entrepreneurship, and industrial policy as a means of sustaining economic and political stability over time. It's about examining the role of trade policy as well as technology policy in education and training and development of all men and women as well. So those are some of the objectives of policymakers in fragile states, which includes Afghanistan as well. In terms of methodology, this paper assesses the level of state fragility in Afghanistan and also discusses what can be done to transition the country away from it. So we rely on the Fragile States Index of 2024, as well as the textbook by Dr. Belay Seyoum on state fragility in business and economic performance, an Ethiopian perspective that was published last year. The Fragile State Index, otherwise known as FSI, developed by the Fund for Peace in 2023, assesses state fragility across 12 indicators, which include security apparatus, factionalized elites, group grievances, economic decline, uneven economic development, human rights and brain drain, state legitimacy, public service, human rights, a rule of law, security and crime, and external interventions. Result of state fragility would be the fact that there are some consequences, but the root of those consequences need to be looked at to see what the causes are, what causes those consequences. So if the local government does not have legitimacy or authority or capacity to take care of the local citizens during a day-to-day normal operation or during crisis, that's a problem. So that leads to an increased rate of crimes and violence. It leads to wars among different groups of people, including externals who are trying to influence the country in their direction. And also, we would see a huge amount of human rights violations. So the causes and the outcomes sometimes can be in reverse. Something can be cause as well as an outcome as well. And unfortunately, this vicious cycle would continue and the nation falls into a trap when that happens. So there's a good balancing act of state fragility's causes as well as outcomes. And that's where policymakers have to pay more attention to make sure we reduce the biggest priorities first to make sure we have security. We don't allow factionalized elite to do things for their own benefit. We don't allow ethnic politics. We don't allow ethnically based federations. When you have insufficient public services, that can become a problem and unfortunately create insecurity. And the country's economic development would be on a decline. And then we see human flight or brain drain. That means the most educated leave in search of economic well-being in other places. So that's not good for a country or a nation. Afghanistan ranks among the top 20 climate vulnerable countries. So the disasters have devastated many communities, which deteriorates stability among local populations. According to Displaced International, 23.7 million Afghans are in acute need, with 11.6 million experiencing catastrophic food insecurity as of 2025. And 3.2 million Afghans are internally displaced, and 8.2 million have sought refuge abroad in many neighboring countries, as well as European and North American states. So the question is Afghanistan a failed state? Well, in Afghanistan's case, the FSI ranking has consistently ranked Afghanistan among the most fragile states in the world. In 2022, Afghanistan was ranked third out of 179 countries in terms of fragility. Afghanistan's scores are particularly low in areas such as security apparatus, factionalized elites, and state legitimacy. So we need to answer the question of whether Afghanistan is a failed state or not. And to do that, we can look at more data. So again, the FSI index on global data, you can see here, shows Afghanistan as being one of the top 7 fragile states. So some of these countries are going in a positive direction, some are getting worse. Haiti is having a lot of challenges over the last year, but Afghanistan probably is getting more and more secure. So if that is the case, then we need to look at the question again, is Afghanistan a failed state? And the answer would be no. However, Afghanistan is not obviously one of the least fragile states. That's the goal where we need to go toward. For example, countries like Portugal, Singapore, Germany, Austria, Sweden, Australia, Netherlands, Luxembourg, Canada, and many others fall in the least fragile states. In other words, there's more security in entrepreneurship and development, and people are not worried about where they're going to get their food and whether they're going to be alive the next week or two or not. So people are not displaced regularly in these least fragile states, where in most fragile states, that's a chronic problem. So Afghanistan is categorized as a country on high alert status with an overall fragility score of 103.9. Of course, Afghanistan's overall ranking of being the seventh most fragile state in 2024 is a huge concern for you, for me, for policymakers in Afghanistan, and for our friends all over the globe. And some people might consider that as a failed state status. However, carefully considering all elements of state fragility based on research and other experts, my short answer is no. Afghanistan is not a failed state because there's rule of law, there's security, and people can resort to local leaders to solve challenging problems. However, a failed state is typically categorized by various factors which are present in Afghanistan, such as collapse or weakness of governance in some cases, or some periods of times, loss of control over territory, inability to provide public services, erosion of legitimacy, high levels of violence and insecurity, which we have experienced quite often over the last 4 decades. So in many parts of the world, including Afghanistan, people have protested discrimination, marginalization from social and economic opportunities, and demanding social justice. Overall, people have mobilized around old grievances involving ethnic, religious, or even cultural identities and are demanding acknowledgement and recognition by the wider society, whether it's in Afghanistan or other parts of the world. We see this happening on a regular basis. Authoritarian constitutions sometimes use window dressing that provide lip service to the rule of law and other fundamental freedoms without the intention to enforce them. So formal institutions include laws, regulations, and rules that establish the basis for production, for exchange, and for distribution of wealth to all individuals throughout the country at all levels. An important explanation of state fragility is the state's incompetence in economic management and lack of administrative capacity to translate goals into resource allocation. In many fragile states, conflict leads to institutional voids, and people engage in novel and sometimes informal partnerships to compensate for these institutional gaps. Existing institutions therefore become inefficient and somewhat fragmented, and people then must work together to fill these organizational gaps using local elders in the communities, which obviously has happened in Afghanistan, where people relied on Taliban to solve their problems over the last 20 years when Taliban were not formally in position of power in the government. So that basically means as long as there is some rule that can govern major decisions and major crises in local community, then the country cannot always be considered a failed state. Institutions must be strengthened to prevent countries from going from a fragile state into a failed state. So institutions are a set of formal and informal rules which govern the actions of individuals and organizations, as well as the interaction of participants in the development process. State fragility causes severe development challenges due to weak institutional capacity, due to poor governance, due to conflicts among groups of people, and due to political instability. So when states fail, population is displaced, human capital is depleted, and the nation's production and income tend to decline. By 2030, while 78% of non-fragile states come close to achieving the goal of ending extreme poverty, only 19% of fragile states are expected to achieve that goal. And unfortunately, Afghanistan is not expected to be one of that 19%. In conclusion, we can say that increased poverty elevates the risk of conflict, leading to a self-reinforcing trend known as fragility trap. And this vicious cycle keeps countries away from political stability and any hope of reducing poverty. Afghanistan must focus on sound policies locally and with regional and global partners. Home economics, entrepreneurship, and good industrial policies that can be enforced and reinforced over and over again are the key to making sure Afghanistan becomes stronger and move out of this state fragility alert status. Good trade policy can help local farmers, it can help home economics experts to basically sell their products and trade them with other communities, other cities, other states, and neighboring countries as well. Technology policy, making things easier for local people in each community, for both men and women to benefit from educational opportunities that are available. So virtually connecting people to the latest technologies would be a key to transitioning out of state fragility for Afghanistan and the people of every community in each city within the country. Some of the guiding principles for economic development include social equity, which ensures that economic benefits are shared fairly among all members of society, thereby reducing poverty and inequality between different ethnic groups, between men and women, and obviously between various cities throughout the country. Another element would be environmental sustainability. We need to protect the natural environment and conserve natural resources for future generations. There's also institutional stability to establish a stable and effective institutional framework to support economic development of everyone throughout the country. And finally, the human development is an important principle. So this means investing in education, in the healthcare, and other essential services to improve human well-being and productivity for all men and women throughout Afghanistan. In Afghanistan, the good news is that the female-dominated skills are plentiful. For example, women in Afghanistan have been really experts in traditional handicrafts, food processing and preservation, textile production, agricultural management, business management, financial management, in some cases, craftsmanship, herbal medicine and cosmetics, education and training, community development, and traditional handicrafts, as I mentioned earlier. So there are many areas that Afghan women have done very, very well over the past century. The key is to enable them to make these, as entrepreneurs, opportunities to generate income for themselves and for their communities as well. Historically, we know that Afghanistan has struggled with low literacy rates, which is a main factor in any nation's fragility status. In 1979, the literacy rate in Afghanistan was 18.16%. Today, in 2025, it's estimated that the functional literacy in Afghanistan is approximately 37.3%, which means 62% of Afghans are functionally illiterate, which is very, very high. It is true that a country with high education levels might not actually suffer from brain drain to the same extent as another nation with low levels of literacy in its population. So this is unfortunately a big problem for Afghanistan. Afghan men have a literacy rate of 52% approximately, which means 48% of illiteracy. Afghan women, on the other hand, have a literacy rate of 22.6%, which leaves 77% as illiterate. This high illiteracy and gender gap is a result of various factors, obviously, including limited access to education, particularly for women and girls in rural areas of Afghanistan. Unfortunately, many of them have never had access to schooling and education. So that's a challenge, and it will remain a challenge, and we need to do more to solve these issues and provide access to everyone to become functionally literate and achieve the educational levels that they can achieve. 2019, about 17% of the world's population remained illiterate compared to 78% in 1820. So that's a huge transition from where it was over a century ago to what it is now. Millions of Afghan school-age children remain out of school because of poverty and because of conflict. Increasing the functional literacy rate in Afghanistan must be a top priority for educators, for teachers, and for students in higher ed, and obviously for business people and local policymakers and government officials. Failure to educate boys and girls not only comes at a high cost to their health and well-being, but is estimated to cost the global economy about 30 trillion in lost earnings and productivity, and that number is only associated with the lack of education for girls. The education of all girls and increasing the functional literacy rate in Afghanistan, again, must be a top priority for all stakeholders. Some recommendations include the fact that we can look at other nations that have recovered from being in a fragile state as a nation to being economic powerhouse in the global community. So Singapore offers a really good example of a country that has gone from being an average nation in Asia to being one of the powerhouses in a matter of 50 to 60 years. They did this by having a long-term plan and vision, by investment in human capital, through diversification, economic development. They focused on anti-corruption measures. They had a really good infrastructure development plan. They did it through social cohesion and national unity among all their members or their ethnic backgrounds. They did it through strategic partnerships and international engagement with the global community. They did it through institutional capacity building and adaptability and resilience. So yes, Singapore has a very small population, less than 10 million people. In Afghanistan is 4 times bigger than them at least. But nonetheless, they've done something that many countries have not been able to achieve. So perhaps Singapore can be used as a model for the development of Afghanistan. So I encourage students, professors, and policymakers to do more research as a case study to see how Singapore achieved this transformation that has made them an economic powerhouse. Hopefully some of those recommendations can be passed on for Afghanistan when you publish your papers, so policymakers can consider them in the future policies. So in summary, let me say that recognizing and accommodating diverse ethnic, religious, and language identities of every community in Afghanistan through inclusionary approaches must be enforced by law, by you and I as role models and examples, and by the tradition in Afghanistan in order for Afghanistan to transition out of the state fragility status and become an economic powerhouse in the decades to come. Thank you for listening to this presentation. Dr. Belay Seyoum and I look forward to your comments and replies regarding research opportunities and your interest. Good luck.